Hi, my name is Ria Newman. This is my integrative personality application paper on Aileen Wuornos for Psych 2301. Today I will be analyzing Aileen Wuornos by using Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory and Karen Horney's neoanalytic theory. Aileen Wuornos was a leap year baby. She was born on February 29, 1956, but this is just the beginning of her interesting life story. Wuornos is known for being the second woman to die by execution in Florida and the 10th woman who has died by execution in the United States. Wuornos was charged with murder 6 times but is said to have killed 8 men in total between the years 1998 and 1990, giving her the nickname of the Damsel of Death. She was executed on October 2, 2000 at the Florida State Prison. On this day, she refused her last meal and instead asked for a cup of coffee. Aileen Wuornos was born to a 14-year-old mother and 19-year-old father, both of which she had little to no connection with during her life. She was raised in Troy, Michigan, primarily by her grandmother and grandfather, as her mother abandoned her and her older brother when Aileen was 4 years old. As for her father, she had never met him, as he and her mother divorced shortly after she was born, and was in and out of prison during the time she lived with her mother. Unfortunately, starting from the time she was given to her grandparents, Aileen was abused emotionally, physically, and verbally by her alcoholic grandfather. In addition to struggling at home, Aileen also struggled at school, as she did poor work in anything academic based and was labeled the weird girl by her peers. She began abusing alcohol and running away from home for periods at a time at age 12. Her teachers were worried, but nothing was done for her. At the age of 14, Aileen's grandfather kicked her out of the house after she had gotten pregnant. From that time on, Aileen made money through prostitution and lived with acquaintances throughout her life. To begin analyzing Aileen Wuornos' personality, I will first look at Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory, which focuses on the unconscious part of the mind. Freud used his studies of the unconscious to try to get a better understanding of a person's motives and behaviors, as he believed our unconscious drives most of our behaviors. From the psychoanalytic theory, I will be using Freud's psychosexual stages of development in 3 out of 8 of his defense mechanisms. Freud created the psychosexual stages of development to describe 5 stages of psychological development in childhood. In his theory, Freud believed that in order to become psychologically mature, an individual would have to successfully pass each stage. If a stage is not completed successfully, the individual will develop a fixation that symbolizes that stage in some way. The theory is criticized as Freud believed that sexual energy was a driving force behind each stage and created each stage with an underlying sexual energy. Out of the 5 psychosexual stages, I believe Aileen Wuornos shows signs of fixation in the last 3: the phallic stage, latency period, and general stage. To begin, the phallic stage begins at age 4 and focuses on the genitals. During this period, Freud believes girls should develop a strong relationship with their fathers in order to overcome their penis envy or inferiority. This is interesting for Wuornos because she did not grow up with a father. However, I believe she could have passed this stage successfully if she could have developed a strong relationship with her grandfather. The sign of fixation for this stage is Wuornos' lack of serious relationships with men in her adult life. The only relationships that she had with men that are worth mentioning were men that paid her for sex and the men that she killed. Moving on to the second stage that I believe Wuornos is fixated in would be the latency period, which begins around age 6 and lasts until the onset of puberty. During this stage, Freud believed that there is a lack of sexual drive and said energy was focused on mastering skills in school and making friends. This stage would have been difficult for Aileen, as the only skill she developed in school was art, and she had no friends. The sign of fixation is seen in a lack of socialization later in her life. Those who knew Wuornos always spoke kindly of her, but these relationships were superficial as Wuornos stayed away from creating deep connections with others. The last stage that I believe Wuornos to have developed a fixation in would be the general stage. This begins at at the onset of puberty and focuses sexual energy on developing sexual and romantic relationships while maturing into successful adults. During this time in her life, Aileen began abusing drugs and alcohol heavily and was being sexually abused by several men, including her brother. The sign of fixation for this stage in her immature nature, which can be seen during her interviews and recordings of her court hearings, where she often curses at judges and the jury. The second part of Freud's psychoanalytic theory that I will be applying to Aileen Wuornos is his theory of defense mechanisms. Freud claimed that the ego, the structure of the unconscious that creates reason and meditation, uses defense mechanisms to protect itself from potentially dangerous stimuli. Freud created 8 mechanisms, but today I will be talking about 3: denial, displacement, and rationalization in a chronological order of Wuornos' life. To begin, denial is seen in Wuornos' life around age 11 when she refused to believe that her grandparents were not her real parents. Up until this point, her grandparents had told her that they were her mom and dad, and once the truth was revealed, Wuornos refused to believe them. It is said that she could not believe a person that was not even her own father could treat her so poorly. In addition to her reaction as a child, Wuornos is also interviewed days before her execution, and she refers to her grandfather and grandmother as dad and mom, which shows that she lived with this denial her entire life. Moving on to displacement, which is described as a shift of fear to a less threatening object when the real object is too threatening to face. This can be applied to Wuornos, as it is said that the anger she released during her murders stemmed from the anger that she held towards her grandfather. This makes sense as she killed during her interactions with men and easily could have taken control of the situation. Lastly, I focused on rationalization, which is said to occur when an individual gives false explanations for his or her behaviors when the subconscious motive is too much to omit. This occurs during Wuornos' time in court, as she changed her reason for killing the men several times, but her main claim was that each of the killings were out of self-defense. If she had killed out of anger towards her grandfather, she might have not been able to be aware of her subconscious motive and claimed self-defense instead. Next, I will be going into the neo-analytic theory of Karen Horney, a German psychologist. Horney's theory focuses on childhood development and parent relationships, as she believes that all personality flaws stem from poor parent relations. This is interesting as she herself had an odd relationship with her parents and most likely based a lot of her theory off of her own childhood. From her theory, I will be applying her ideas of basic anxiety, ideas of self, and neuroticism to Aileen Wuornos. Karen Horney coined the term basic anxiety to describe the feelings of fear, hopelessness, and loneliness a child feels due to poor parent relations. She believed that basic anxiety caused children to develop 1 out of 3 adaptation styles to help them deal with the stresses of the world. The 3 styles are passive, which causes individuals to be easygoing and become followers, an aggressive style which causes individuals to fight and become very defensive in social situations, and lastly a withdrawn style which causes people to detach themselves from emotional connection and social interactions. Out of the 3, I believe Horney would categorize Wuornos to have a withdrawn style, as she was known to avoid deep connections with people in order to avoid getting hurt. In fact, the only known deep connection Aileen had was with her ex-girlfriend Tyra Moore, who sided with the side of law enforcement during Wuornos' trial by telling investigators that Wuornos had killed the men and would come home and talk about it often. Next, I will go into Horney's idea of self. Horney believed that an individual's self-image and personal idea of who they are was very important to their psychological self, and therefore created 3 descriptions of ideas of self that individuals can identify with. The real self is the most important level of self, as Horney believed that the closer an individual identifies with their real self, the closer to self realization he or she will be, which is the goal in Horney's theory. But Horney claimed that if the real self was damaged during childhood, then it will forever be damaged and an individual will never be able to reach full self realization. The second level of self that was created was a despised self, which Horney claims to be the self that negative perception people see themselves as. This self is dangerous to a person's psychological health. Lastly, Horney created an ideal self, which described the person an individual wishes they were. Each self is important, but Horney claims that it's healthy to stay as close to the real self as possible. And if an individual strays too far from his or her real self, in either despised or ideal way, an individual can become neurotic, which will be explained further in the next slide. Out of the three selves, Aileen Wuornos shows signs of identifying with her despised self the most through years of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and allowing her value in life to be used for sex. Once a person becomes neurotic, which occurs when an individual is too detached from his or her real self, he or she will develop one of the three coping mechanisms to help in social interactions. Horney claims that a healthy person who identifies with his or her real self would use a mix of the three mechanisms. The mechanisms that Horney created are moving towards others, moving away from others, and moving against others, and can closely be linked to the other three mechanisms she created to cope with anxiety. The first mechanism, moving towards, describes individuals who get involved in social interactions to look for love and approval. The second, moving away, describes individuals who withdraw themselves from social interactions and almost all emotional investment from any relationship in order to protect themselves from getting hurt. Lastly, those who develop the move against others will seek power in relationships in order to control the situations. Out of the three, Aileen best fits the move away mechanism, as it is mentioned in the previous slide that she never connected to people on a deep level. In conclusion, Aileen Wuornos is an interesting person with an interesting story, which unfortunately got dramatized for profit and fame. However, the truth of her story still holds a lot of information that people can use in several areas such as women's rights, anti-child abuse and neglect motives, and even prison reform cases. It can be said that Wuornos had several fixations according to Freud's psychosexual development theory and used his defense mechanisms throughout her life, or that Karen Horney would have considered her a neurotic, withdrawn individual. But it is important to keep in mind that although there is fitting evidence for such claims, does not mean it is true, as most of the information the world has on Aileen Wuornos has been altered in some way or another.